Hey, so we looks like we're starting to reach critical mass in terms of the number who've joined us today. Thank you all for joining us on this afternoon for the launch of our climate budgeting webinar. This is the first guide launched by the NZAP partnership, and we're very excited to have you all with us today. Bonjour à toutes et à tous, et merci de vous joindre à nous aujourd'hui. Um, my name is Emma Kirk. I use they, them pronouns, and I'm a project officer with Capacity Development Unit in with FCM's Green Municipal Fund, working specifically on the Net Zero Action Research Partnership. We're also joined today by my colleagues Isabel Oke, Nadine Ingabire, and Ray Landrio with the Green Municipal Fund's Capacity Development Team, who will help us out on the back end with any tech issues should the need arise. We also have some fantastic speakers from NZAP joining us today, who will introduce in just a moment after I get through my portion of the presentation. To start off our session, I'm going to go to the next slide. I would like to start off with a couple housekeeping items. First, the webinar today will be taking place fully in English with French simultaneous interpretation available. To join the French interpretation, you can click the interpretation button in the lower right hand of your screen. Alors, la session aujourd'hui va dérouler en anglais. Si vous souhaitez écouter en français, veuillez cliquer sur le bouton d'interprétation en bas à droite de votre écran, c'est le petit globe. We also will have two separate slide decks in English et en français. If you go to the view options at the top of your screen, you should be able to toggle between them. As we move through the presentations and the panel today, I ask that you submit your questions via the Q&A box so that we can address them at the overall Q&A at the end. You're welcome to ask the questions in the language of your choice throughout the presentation and the panel. I'd like to start off first with a land acknowledgement. I'd like to acknowledge that I'm joining today from the unceded, unsurrendered territory of the Anishinaabe Algonquin Nation. I'm grateful to the past and present stewards of this beautiful place that I call home at the meeting of the three rivers, including the Great Kitchissippi, that have carried people here for time immemorial. As an organization, FCM acknowledges with gratitude that our head offices are located on the unceded, unsurrendered territory of the Anishinaabe Algonquin Nations in Ottawa. As we move forward with our commitment to reconciliation, we endeavor to unlearn colonial mindsets and practices, grow in knowledge, and adapt in ways of working. As we continue to build meaningful relationships, we recognize the historic and ongoing contributions of Indigenous peoples and honor their leadership and partnership in shaping and strengthening communities across the country. Wherever you are, I encourage you to please join me in paying our respects to the original stewards of this land and committing ourselves to thoughts and actions that will lead to meaningful reconciliation wherever we live and work now. We encourage you to add where you're joining from in the chat as we begin the webinar today. And now I'm going to pass the session along to Megan Meany, the Executive Director of ICLEI Canada and one of the partnership's co-chairs. Megan, over to you.
Thanks, Emma. Hello, everyone. Bienvenue à toutes et à tous. My name is Megan Meany. I'm the Executive Director of ICLEI Canada, and I've been working with local governments across Canada on climate work for over 25 years now, most recently the last few years on climate budgeting. So we're at the beginning of a really busy year for NZAP as we begin releasing the products of our research that began over 2 years ago. Today, we're sharing our new guide on climate budgeting. So we'll start shortly with a brief presentation of the guide, as well as a link to the new resource. And then afterwards, we're having a panel discussion with a group of experienced climate budgeting practitioners, and you'll be able to ask them questions. And then finally, we'll turn back to Emma to talk about some peer learning opportunities. So next slide. For those of you for whom it might be the first time hearing from us, NZAP is a research partnership funded in part by the Government of Canada through the Climate Action and Awareness Fund and jointly led by the University of Waterloo, FCM's Green Municipal Fund, and ICLEI Canada. And we're working alongside 11 academic institutions, 8 national organizations, and 15 municipal partners. It's a truly action research partnership. We've got so many partners with diverse backgrounds playing a role in scoping and shaping the research and the research outputs. You can see many of those partner logos on the screen now. It's really a collaboration that benefits both the researchers and the practitioners, and it's built on a foundation of mutual interest and respect, striving to meet Canada's net zero goals. Next slide. Here you can see the high-level goals of NZAP. Almost. We aim to support Canadian municipalities to monitor, measure, and achieve their GHG mitigation goals aligned with our national reduction commitments by studying and creating an improved measurement, analysis, and monitoring systems for both corporate and community-wide GHG emissions. On our next slide, we're moving on to our structure. Here you can see how we've organized ourselves by working groups, each focused on a specific area of our overarching goal. Last year, you might have attended one of our sessions on the release of our report and database on the state of climate action in Canadian municipalities. That was produced by Working Group 1. So if you've not had a chance to check out those resources, I'll encourage you to get the links. I think my colleagues are going to pop some of that in the chat right now. And today we're focusing in on the outputs of Working Group 3, specifically the Climate Budgeting Guide. So the next slide. As an academic practitioner researcher collaboration, we facilitate knowledge transfer between academic and municipal practitioners, bridging the gap between practice and theoretical work. However, we acknowledge that there are many other gaps that exist in our climate action work that need bridging, including gaps in how reconciliation, anti-racism, equity, and inclusion show up in our work or not. Who's engaged in the conversation and research, and who is meaningfully a part of the planning and action of our collaborative climate response. We have committed to challenging our research, our colleagues, and our products to advance the integration of reconciliation, anti-racism, equity, and inclusion principles into all we do. And further, we commit to openness and learning in areas where it's identified that we can and need to do better. So next slide, before I hand it over to Jolene to properly introduce the Climate Budgeting Guide, I'm going to start off with a quick introduction to the term, just to get us all on the same page. In our guide, we define climate budgeting as a governance system that mainstreams climate commitments and considerations into decision-making on policies, action, and budget allocation by integrating climate targets and climate impact evaluation into the financial budgeting process and assigning responsibility for implementation, monitoring, evaluation, and reporting across the municipal government. It's typically approached through phased implementation over iterative budget cycles. Its scope expands to include the impacts and actions related to climate mitigation, adaptation, and transition risk at the corporate and community levels, and integrates equity into each of these dimensions. In our research, we found that there were a lot of different working interpretations of climate budgeting, carbon budgeting, and other complementary terms. So we tried to unite under a clear definition while also keeping space for interpretation, innovation, and adaptation. So this is all laid out in great detail at the beginning of the guide in the definitions section for you to dive into. Next slide. So many of you on the webinar today, you already have experience in municipal climate budgeting and assessment and planning and implementation. So turning to an approach via climate budgeting might require some thoughtful consideration for you. We've found that you can build on your strong foundation to drive further towards climate goals through climate budgeting. It can help address issues of pace, scale, and orientation. Pace, meaning it helps shift the focus from long-term planning to more immediate operational work plans. Scale, meaning it helps distribute knowledge and ownership of climate action across the organization, not just to the traditional environmental staff. And then orientation meaning it helps forecast potential impacts of municipal decisions rather than calculating them after the fact. So you'll find many more of these sort of business case factors for climate budgeting in the guide. So now to introduce the guide properly to you, I'm going to hand it over to Julene Marlowe, one of the lead authors of the guide. She's also a CPA and a CA from Memorial University of Newfoundland and Labrador. Over to you, Julene.
Thank you, Megan. Bonjour à tous et toutes. Je suis ravie d'être ici aujourd'hui. Hello, everyone. I'm delighted to be here today. As just introduced, I'm Jelaine, a CPA CA. I'm one of the lead authors, along with Megan, for the climate budgeting guide that we're introducing. So just a bit of a quick introduction further. I've been actively involved in this evolving field of sustainable accounting for over a decade now in some capacity. And I'm also part of the NZAP team who's been learning from leading research, cities, other practitioners, and municipal employees that are developing, implementing, and working within different aspects of climate budgeting. We started back about late 2023 to mid 2024 through the support of Dr. Clark and the NZAT Working Group 3 members, where we were fortunate to meet and learn from many municipal leaders in the climate budgeting space across Canada. And this really informed the guide that we're going to be presenting today. We conducted 6 focus groups, 48 interviews, and hosted a workshop with 7 municipalities on climate budgeting. These municipalities included Barrie, Calgary, Edmonton, Mississauga, Montreal, Toronto, and Vancouver, who are all actively working on different stages of climate budgeting. To ensure breadth of knowledge, there were representatives from various departments and levels within the organization. This included staff, management, senior leadership, and elected officials. And we shared all of those discussions with with the NZAP Working Group 3, who then engaged and shared it with Dunsky Energy and Climate Advisors to aid in the development of the resources for all Canadian municipalities on embedding climate budgeting processes within the municipal systems for climate budgeting. And one of those deliverables is what we're going to be talking about, and I'm going to dive in deeper related to the climate budgeting guide. Next slide, please. So during the conversations with Canadian municipalities, we really wanted to understand what was working, what was not working, and how climate budgeting can aid municipalities. What we found was that there are a number of reoccurring themes related to climate budgeting work, many that I anticipated, but some were quite interesting and really insightful. Here on the slide, I've included some quotes that came up from a few of the conversations that I had that highlight some of the themes that are really grounded on the current work that's happening within these municipalities. Overwhelmingly, we did see that there is a consensus that climate budgeting is beneficial to the organizations. Through these discussions, the importance and need for climate budgeting is clear, specifically on how it can better guide and aid in climate-focused management decisions related to budgetary decisions. Specific benefits that came up included having better systems in place to better assess municipal projects, report on KPIs, strategic goals, climate commitments, which aid in enhancing the understanding of climate impacts. However, challenges are also vast, and some of those that included were information gaps that exist, such as data availability and timeliness, balancing competing priorities that a municipality faces, making it difficult with ranking priorities against each other. Further, the complexity and lack of expertise available to support different aspects of the climate science within the systems of climate budgeting, the ability to obtain assurance that is often sought after by us auditors and accounting practitioners, and a lack of clear guidance and accessible tools for all aspects of the process of implementing climate budgeting. And therefore, many resources were needed and are needed to build these systems prior to implementation. Thus, the focus of this climate budgeting guide is closely aligned to the last point, as it's here to aid in making the transition and implementation of climate budgeting more attainable through laying out steps on how it can be embedded into the current municipal systems, regardless of the size of the municipality. Next, I'm going to share a high-level overview of what you can expect to find in the climate budgeting guide. Next slide, please. The guide is divided into 4 main sections, which are outlined here in the 4 parts on the slide. The first is the climate budgeting overview, the second being the current landscape, the climate budgeting process, and then the future directions, each of which I'm going to individually provide a high-level overview next. Next slide, please. In part one, the climate budgeting overview defines climate budgeting in the context of this guide and outlines the business case for local governments. As Megan has already highlighted some of these items within part one, it does include defining what climate budget is, why climate budgeting is important to municipalities, and the overall objectives. This includes how climate budgeting can drive action at the pace, scale, and orientation necessary to confront the climate crisis, but also the climate budget transformation potential. This section highlights the importance of understanding the positive impacts municipalities can see through climate budgeting, and also the importance of a process that involves cross-departmental collaboration and that it cannot be siloed to finance or climate departments alone. Rather, climate budgeting distributes ownership, knowledge, and accountability for climate action to more departments and staff within the organization and in the community. Next slide, please. In part two, the guide provides the climate budgeting overview through considering the current Canadian and international landscape. We employed a Canadian lens, engaging in discussions with 17 municipalities across 11 provinces and territories during late 2023 and 2024 about their awareness, actions, and plans in relating to climate budgeting. Further, key international perspectives were obtained through international resources and interviews with teams leading the largest collaborative cohorts at C40 Cities and ICLEI USA Resource X. In part two of the guide, the actions and approaches to climate budgeting informed by the research is outlined, and some of the key takeaways we saw were that climate budgeting is progressing at different levels globally. Leading Canadian municipalities take a phased implementation approach, which allows them to start sooner and then evolve their processes and frameworks over time. And also, leading international practitioners' initial climate budgeting cycles have largely focused on mitigation. However, the next phases will include a focus on climate adaptation. Next slide, please. Moving on to part three, this is where the climate budgeting process is introduced, and it walks through the main steps in establishing a climate budget. The process map shown provides an overview of the 7 steps of the climate budgeting process for supporting municipalities in starting or advancing their climate budgeting work. Each step is described in detail within the guide, including tips, examples, and resources from leading municipalities and international cohorts. In addition, within part 3, phased implementation is discussed, and tips for smaller municipalities and teams are incorporated to ensure that the guide is a resource for more than just our largest municipalities. As a quick overview of the process, which is further detailed in the guide, step 1 is about building knowledge to emphasize learning about climate budgeting and the importance to create a business case for advancing your climate objectives. Next, step 2 is about the need to assemble a team and framework, talking about and outlining assembling a cross-departmental and the importance of establishing strong senior leadership. It discusses designing a climate budgeting framework that outlines the objectives, scope, team, other departments' roles and responsibilities, and the project plan and timeline. In step 3 is where you map and integrate the process with a goal to develop a deeper understanding of the climate budgeting process and map the financial budgeting process to determine how to best align and integrate within existing processes. Step 4 moves to establish baselines, targets, and trajectories. So it outlines the need to establish a baseline scenario based on current conditions and use long-term climate targets to establish trajectories. These are then used to estimate annual limits, such as the carbon budgets and the scale of action that would be required. In step 5, it identifies, evaluates, and prioritizes measures. So this is qualitatively as well as quantitatively to estimate the impact. So the number of actions, GHG emissions, impact on adaptation indicators, and the cost of select individual measures. The data is then used to inform project prioritization as well as funding. In step 6 is where municipalities prepare and adopt the climate budget by working closely with departments to prepare budgetary proposals following the new integrated climate and financial budgeting process. And then finally, in step 7 is where municipalities monitor, adjust, and report on measure implementation status and anticipated climate deficits while working with departments to seize opportunities and minimize negative impacts. Through the discussion on a phased approach within the 7 steps, the guide highlights that it's not necessary for all elements to be in place prior to starting climate budgeting. Municipalities can still make significant progress towards aligning their governance structures and budgeting processes with climate action through working on some aspects of the steps. And most importantly, do not let perfect be the enemy of good. Start where you can and build from there. Next slide, please. Part 4 outlines future directions, which discusses plans for the next phase of climate budgeting by key organizations. Climate budgeting is a relatively new and quickly evolving field of practice. Through practice and experience, collective work is expected to become more comprehensive, particularly in the area of physical climate risk assessment, carbon offsets, procurement, and standardization, and also community partnerships. Another common finding between municipalities is that climate adaptation, risk, and resilience is less mature and historically under-resourced compared to climate mitigation. We see this as an item of importance in future directions as several leading Canadian municipalities have already started to integrate adaptation and/or risk into climate budgeting. To realize the future direction and full potential of municipal climate budgeting, this section also highlights future resources that will be key in advancing this work forward. Next slide, please. Throughout my work on the guide and experience with and within municipalities, I've been fortunate to learn a number of insights that really focus around implementation for practice. I'm really driven, and our team was really driven on how can we implement systems effectively and also efficiently. It goes without saying that different sized municipalities have different needs and access to resources. Coming from a small town in Newfoundland, just an hour drive from where this beautiful photo was taken in Grossmore National Park, I believe that it's important to understand how we can make climate budgeting accessible for all municipalities, regardless of size. So the guide does have suggestions on how to get started. A few I wanted to highlight is the first is to not wait for perfection or to have everything. Many of those leading the way started small, and then they, after a few cycles, periods, and transitions grew to where they are today. Having someone to champion the initiative will help, but also creating committees to support will also ensure that it's not individually tied. For who it's involved, I hear over and over the importance of ensuring that it's not just siloed, but rather that something that needs to be communicated, designed, and implemented. Within the guide, we highlight who should be involved in each step of the process. For gaining momentum, a focus on senior leadership support and council support is vital, but also identifying funding opportunities and partnering with other municipalities can be a great way to encourage positive and supporting environments as well. The last item is related to resources available. So our climate budgeting guide seeks to support more municipalities wanting to incorporate climate budgeting. Also, we acknowledge all the great work that already exists to support them, and we've included and linked current resources that are available to municipalities within the guide, such as those published by ICLEI, FCM, C40, and all levels of government and other leading organizations. Next slide, please. In conclusion, and before we move on to the workshop, I want to leave you with just one kind of takeaway from this, and it's that climate budgeting is a tool for everyone, regardless of where you are in the process. And a key point to remember is we do not need to be perfect to make positive change. Thank you. Merci. I'll pass it back over to you, Megan.
Thanks so much, Jolene. That was great. It's nice to think of how people have multiple screens open right now. They're walking through the guide with you as you present it and already thinking about how they bring it back to their own communities. It's been really great for me to work with Jolene over the last couple of years. I find it very interesting because I tend to work a lot with the municipal sustainability practitioners, and she's coming at it from a very different auditor's perspective. And we didn't always see eye to eye, but we came to know each other's worlds very well. And I think many of the folks on the call will also have this experience as they go through tackling climate budgeting together. So thanks so much, Jolene. So now we're going to move on to the panel portion of the webinar today. And we're thrilled to have an excellent panel of folks with their own perspectives on climate budgeting to lend to a rich discussion. So we've got Matt Rieger first from the city of Saskatoon. We've also got Robert Stupka from C40 Cities. We've got Philip Guy from Accounting for Sustainability. And then we've got Dr. Amelia Clark from the University of Waterloo. So we're going to begin with a series of questions for each of our panelists. And after that, we're going to take questions from our audience. So I encourage you to put your questions in that Q&A box. so we can make sure we get to them. So we're going to start off with the municipal practitioner perspective. So that's for you, Matt. So Saskatoon is one of a handful of municipalities that's done climate budgeting in Canada for a couple of years now, right? What have you accomplished through climate budgeting that you might not have been able to accomplish through your past approaches to climate action? And then part two of that question is like, what advice would you have for your peers attending this webinar on how they can use climate budgeting to advance their goals and work towards their net zero targets?
Yeah, Megan, thanks for the questions. So we're in the middle of preparing our second climate budget, and I'm sure others will agree, the ones that are kind of on this path as well. It's a process that evolves, right? So at the end of the day, we want to inform decision makers about the climate-related aspects of the projects they're being asked to fund, and a climate budget adds that lens. This work needs to be supported by the finance department, as it's, at least here, it's delivered by them as part of the city's multi-year budget process. Interestingly, our first climate budget didn't get as much attention at budget deliberations, but it did as a part of a larger report on finance and sustainability actions that we took to committee before budget. So a good example, we've had a property assessed clean energy, or PACE, program in place since 2021 for the single family residential building sector. The 2024-2025 budget included a request to expand that program and establish a similar program for the ICI building sector. City Council took this under advisement, but they did not allocate any additional funding at that time. However, the climate budget highlighted that implementing a scaled PACE program could result in significant greenhouse gas reductions with an initiative that paid itself back. So with strong support from City Council, our finance team was willing to think, outside the box, and approved a post-budget loan of $25 million to expand the PACE program to the multi-unit residential and the commercial building sectors. So I guess a few takeaways if you're thinking of implementing the climate budget. And I mean, the guide is lovely. We would have loved to have that when we were starting our journey. But my takeaways are: be clear in what you're asking for and what you're reporting. Get to be best friends with your finance team, and be prepared to pivot as you go. Just rephrasing what has been said already. It'll never be perfect, but in my opinion, it's better to do something than to wait for the right time to do everything. If that makes sense. Thanks.
Thanks, Matt. Yeah, I can imagine, every year it gets better and better, right, as you tackle this through the fiscal cycles. I can imagine there will be many questions for you as we get to the Q&A session. So sit tight. Thank you. So Robert, now I wanted to come over to you. So C40 has been working with municipalities internationally on climate budgeting for a long time now. Of course, with Oslo, the originator of the climate budget. So what stands out to you as unique from this kind of Canadian approach that we've been working on? And what can we as Canadians learn from our international counterparts in this space?
Well, first of all, I'm really happy and I guess proud to see climate budgeting now coming to Canada and being able to be mainstream within a locally contextual resource that we have here. I think that there's a lot of confusion in terms of climate budgeting and what it is and what it is. And so as these resources start to emerge, it helps evolve the practice around this and really understanding that it is a means toward mainstreaming climate action. And as a mayoral membership organization, C40 is, we really emphasize on the need for that institutionalized political buy-in from both mayors as well as the CFOs. And so, as part of C40's own leadership standards, that commitment needs to be there on an annual basis, regardless of who's in power, to be able to have that support behind the entire climate budgeting process. So all of our cities, they do have Paris-aligned climate action plans, and they've been working on implementation, over the better part of the last 5 years toward 2030. And now, you're shaping a little bit more bones behind that. You're trying to mainstream that action, institutionalize it within all decision making, so it's not concentrated within sustainability departments. And you're also looking at having new ways to be able to measure progress beyond greenhouse gas emissions, which are, admittedly lagging indicators and don't include necessarily all the work that's being done. So, we're hoping that this is able to, provide accountability across city departments, able to help assess different budget priorities around climate action, and those are most impactful kind of drop to the top. That cities are assessing, really what is their impact on emissions. So, assessing what is within cities' purview, what is within state or provincial purview, what is within federal purview, to help them be able to also advance the conversation around, what do we have direct control over, what do we need to advocate for outwardly to be successful. So it opens up all these different conversations, and importantly, helps facilitate that the most important actions are really going to be prioritized. I think lastly as well, maybe opens the door as well. We always hear we don't have enough money to do things, but I think the importance of policy in being able to help move the needle on reducing emissions versus things that require money. And I think again, the initial conversations that cities are going to have internally about taking stock in their climate action plan helps kind of really identify kind of, okay, what do we need funding for, and what do we really need policy action?
Great. Thanks so much, Robert. Yeah, that's a good point. Those early conversations are going to be really eye-opening for so many of the communities that start doing this. And thank you to C40. I know every city in Canada that's, contemplating climate budgeting has drawn a lot from C40 resources and blogs and such. So, and as did the creation of this guide. So we're very grateful. So Philip, both Matt and Robert have mentioned how the finance department is very important to getting behind this work. So you work with accounting professionals from many municipalities across Canada and around the world. What added value does their involvement bring to the table? And what advice would you have to the municipal sustainability staff looking to engage their finance departments in this climate budgeting work?
Well, thank you for the question. And to be honest, I mean, my colleagues have pretty much answered the question for me. I mean, it's great to be able to come to this and just sort of have the accountants we are potentially the superheroes that could save the world around climate budgeting. But I suppose just to take a step back, I mean, yes, at Accounting for Sustainability, A4S, we do work across the global finance and accounting system, including working with the standard setters, accounting bodies, and the financial staff of large municipalities and large multinational organizations. So for those looking to engage with their accounting professional colleagues, I suppose the best thing to do is sort of recognize the unique skills that they bring in analyzing and translating opportunities and risks into long-term financial value creation. This includes, for example, identifying cost savings through operational efficiencies, potential funding opportunities, identifying and mitigating financial risks and the economic benefits of those. So accounting professionals also ensure the municipalities comply with the relevant financial regulations and standards, which obviously need to be considered on an annual basis. So applying this to climate action and climate budgeting is really no different to any other area of operations or policy action they would already be working on. So the other side of it is financial teams excel at working with data and using it to present a clear narrative to their stakeholders that demonstrates how climate initiatives can create value. And obviously that will resonate with the decision makers who have to make the decisions on what to move forward with.
I love that. How climate can create value, or climate action can create value. That's really powerful stuff, and it's, I think, very convincing to those that would need to go to the climate folks to build a case for doing so. So thank you, Philip. All right, and Amelia. So I wanted to come to you with more of a research-based question. So we said at the beginning, NZAP represents an action research partnership with both practitioners and researchers contributing to framing the research questions and outputs. So what could we expect to see more of as we work towards a net zero future from your perspective?
Super. Thanks, Megan. And bonjour. Hello, everyone. As you've mentioned, and Jeline mentioned as well, NZAP, through our various working groups, kind of co-creates research to support practice. And the guide being launched today is a perfect example of that, where a lot of the research is being led by academics, but in very close collaboration with the leading municipalities, with ICLEI Canada, in this case with Dunsky Energy and Climate Advisors. and with others. So next for NZAP, we're moving into a knowledge mobilization phase where we'd like to pilot this guide with Canadian municipalities who are interested in using it, and then we're interested in hearing about your experience in using it. So what we're planning to do is, and we've set up, is to do research wrapped around the piloting of this guide and to collect information about the experience in piloting the guide, but also to collect feedback on the usefulness of the guide and any trainings we provide. So the plan for NZAP is to do the same with each of our forthcoming resources, but this one is the first one out the door. And I will say just more generally, from the survey we did in 2023, where 256 Canadian municipalities helped share their current climate action planning and efforts with us, we were able to really get a snapshot of the current state of net zero climate action in Canada and to see where the gaps are and where the needs are. So as NZAP moves forward, we're planning to continue to co-create resources and to continue to provide training that'll help support Canadian municipalities. Yeah, thanks, Megan.
Thanks a million. And I was going to give more information about some of those peer learning opportunities at the end. So great. All right, folks. So please, we're going to open up the panel to Q&A from the audience now. So please put your questions in the Q&A box. I see both the Q&A box and chat box lighting up, but I'm very easily distracted. So I'm going to focus really in on the Q&A box for a second. And the first question, I mean, it's a big one. I'm going to ask it, and any of the panelists, if you have some thoughts on this, please let me know. So how do cities implementing climate budgeting approach the allocation of climate-related portions of larger projects? Curious, as it also links to requests for future funding or reserves for certain projects. I mean, this is a big one. I've had conversations with many municipalities around this. So curious if anyone here has any thoughts.
I'll start. I mean, I think depends if we're talking about mitigation or adaptation. So I think right now a lot of cities are trying to figure out what is the cost of inaction when it comes to adaptation and what that cost premium will be for projects they are contemplating. So I think that is emergent. I know some cities like Philadelphia, for example, they assess projects that are a couple projects being proposed, whether or not they align with their climate change risk assessment. And if there's a risk potentially flagged, then those teams need to come up with a strategy or a plan to be able to mitigate those risks. So, we could see that example of that being integrated within their climate, their budgeting process to really account for that risk and a bit of an accountability mechanism there as well. In terms of Montreal, I believe they're assessing projects over $50 million as a starting point to really, and those big impact projects, they say that has 80% of the overall impact, of the overall greenhouse gas impacts of larger projects. So that's what they're tackling first, to be able to understand kind of what they should be focusing on allocating toward, and as well 10 to 15% of budgets toward adaptation work. So I think it's an evolution. I think they're trying to figure out as they go along. I don't think it's kind of a set number. I think the idea of mainstreaming really is that like all the projects you're looking at or growing your municipality is going to be looked at that it is beneficial from a mitigation adaptation perspective. So
yeah, it really is an evolution. I remember when the city of New York put out their climate budget last year, digging through their appendices, because they had a really interesting methodology that they developed on kind of climate alignment and 3 tiers of alignment that they went through every kind of funded element in their capital plan. So it was really creative use. And then I remember having some other conversations. I think it's Vancouver who was doing some really interesting tagging processes in their books, basically, to determine which project is sort of a climate project. But of course, that's a really difficult conversation to have because, many huge infrastructure projects are going to have climate elements and resilience building elements in them, but they're not exclusively for climate.
Okay.
So it's a curious thing. Any other thoughts on that question around alignment?
It says pilot community.
I can just
Yeah,
chime in
please, Matt.
quickly. So, really, at the end of the day, if a project was linked to our low emissions community plan, which has 40 actions in that, or it's a project that's expected to result in greenhouse gas emissions, that automatically fits within our climate budget. Something we've actually tweaked a bit for this go around is we I won't get into it too much, but we've maybe I'll just leave it there. But the addition to this year's climate budget is that we did add a filter for climate adaptation. So if a project is has been flagged as something that that considers and will benefit climate resiliency, it's not been added to our climate budget.
Mm.
The quantification side, that's a whole nother webinar, I think.
All right. Thanks, Emma, for translating this question for me from French. Much appreciated. It's more in line with maybe an auditor's perspective. So, do current climate budgeting frameworks allow for a reliable post-assessment of municipal climate spending, particularly in terms of traceability and alignment with climate objectives? And part two of that was, do existing mechanisms guarantee real transparency in climate budget execution? And what obstacles stand in the way of producing comprehensive assessments? Thoughts on that one?
Yeah, the short answer is no. And what I mean by that is, like when we're talking about a climate budget, we're trying to identify and quantify the emissions for projects that haven't been done, right? In some cases. So that's where that quantification part becomes tricky. So what we included in our first climate budget, multiple tables, but one is greenhouse gas reduction projects that that we couldn't quantify. But the challenge is, like, when do we quantify that? Does that show up in our biennial climate action progress report, or how are we actually closing that loop on accountability, on making sure that that people are not getting away with not reporting this stuff? So we haven't figured that one out yet, but that's definitely a challenge for us.
Any other thoughts on that one?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's what's in your climate action plan that you've implemented, and there's kind of all the other projects that are out there. And as cities are doing their initial information gathering and evaluating their own processes, they may look to kind of their past budgets and to figure out what is the system by which we're going to be assessing different actions and evaluating, monitoring, et cetera, and assigning responsibility to departments. So I think you kind of look backwards at existing processes to help define how you're going to go forward. But I think an important, you mentioned the New York example, they're now looking at their capital planning process. So we're not just looking at year over year, but I think as you're updating your climate action plan, you're engaging with your various departments and establishing targets and actions, then that's the exact time to be speaking about indicators as well as budget requests, and then starting to kind of look at your capital plan. And so then you really have a good insight in terms of what is it that's going to be required. I think kind of connecting to the previous question that was asked.
Right. Thanks, Robert. Jump into the next question that's come up from Calvin. What are some effective strategies that you've seen gain council buy-in for climate budgeting? There are still various municipalities where councillors are in denial of climate change. Want to tackle that one? Matt, you've lived it.
I keep waiting for someone else to chime in first. But, from our perspective, communications is so important, right? We already talked about getting finance on board, but there's also a lot of, okay, let me think of how to say this. Like, there's communications between the climate budget team and and project managers, between project managers and accounting coordinators, between accounting coordinators and the climate budget team. And then ultimately we roll this up and we communicate this with senior management and council. So at the end of the day, it's a transparency thing, and we just all need to be speaking the same language and at the same tables to work through this. It's not perfect, as I've talked about earlier.
Mhm.
I can chime in as well. I mean, many cities are right now reporting back to council on their progress toward 2030 targets. And that is a very challenging conversation, I think, for many of them to have. But it is an opportunity to engage with them in terms of what more do we need to be able to actually move the needle on where we need to go. And so it's an opener. I think engaging with the CFO in the city internally to kind of figure out what is, what would help move that conversation forward is really important. And getting that, that buy-in. I mean, the process itself is useful, not just from a climate perspective, right? C40 is looking at it from the equity perspective. We're evaluating things from, numerous council priorities. And I think this provides that greater level of accountability across the board. And I think, the more we can tie to, council priorities and, this is how the climate actions are going to help those to achieve those. I think that's the narrative we need to be thinking about.
The big ones that stand out for me are around sharing responsibility and unlocking resourcing. Like, I think the way climate budgeting really shares responsibility beyond the environment department to a cross-departmental and really brings like senior decision makers into that oversight process is a really powerful thing. And then more and more like demonstrated action on climate and continuous action on climate is required to access the types of financing and funding that municipalities need, right? We've seen, requirements from some levels of SCM funding, not on climate budgeting specifically, but on having inventories, having plans in place, doing vulnerability and risk assessments. Infrastructure Canada as well often requires that sort of climate lens before funding is accessible. So it's getting ahead of that kind of expectation as well. Another question. I'm keeping a look at time. We have about 4 more minutes left for the panel discussion, and then I think we send it back to Emma. So this one's interesting. I would ask, is council buy-in for climate budgeting necessary? Or is it more senior admin buy-in? Can it be done without council?
If I could, Megan, just
please.
some of the conversations that I had with the municipalities in Canada, it needs to be both. That would be the biggest takeaway. So you need to have the executive leadership team on board, but you also need to have council and a council champion as well as an internal champion working together to move the pendulum forward and to get things moving. So I think the quick answer is that you kind of need both in order to move it forward in the right direction without it being stopped in one of the other, spots, whether it's council or whether it's with the administration.
Thanks, Julie. Looking through some of the chat for some of the questions that came into the chat instead of the Q&A. I see one that's around, would the guide be applicable to other types of organizations, such as crown corporations?
So Megan, maybe you and I can answer that one.
Great.
So it is created for municipalities with a municipal lens. However, if we go back to TCFD, for those that are familiar with the Task Force for the Climate Financial Disclosures, that was taken and applied by municipalities as well. So I think as long as organizations understand that there is a municipal lens and we thought about municipal stakeholders with the climate budgeting and how the climate budgeting process was developed, I think the answer would be yes. But again, just keeping in mind to identify what would work for that specific organization and how the differences and what differences would exist between a municipality and the specific crown organization that you're referring to, or any organization, private practice included.
Yeah, we're seeing so much, ESG kind of work out there in the private sector. And many of the the businesses that are in your municipalities will be engaging in that sort of reporting as well. So it's nice to, be attuned to what's important for the stakeholders in your own community in terms of their climate action as well.
And just to add to that, I mean, ultimately, the interoperability of everything across all types of operations globally need to sort of align on this, like it does with any type of accounting or reporting, because ultimately, within a municipality, you're going to have key stakeholders such as insurance companies or capital allocators that are looking to give you access to capital, who want to be able to interpret your data, interpret what you're doing and how you're successfully implementing it, to know that they can allocate to you or to give you that insurance you need as you move forward in your climate action plans.
Absolutely. Thanks, Philip. One more question. What do you see for the, sorry, it jumped away. What do you see for the future of regulatory requirements for municipalities for including climate related or ESG disclosures?
I could jump in here very, very quickly. I mean, in terms of the next steps, I mean, within Canada, obviously, it's PSAB controls what we do in Canada. IPSASB have just come out with their sustainability reporting standards, sort of focus on climate reporting. That is looked to be finalized by the end of this year, but they're going to have it split into two sections. One is going to be sort of based, and I won't go into the weeds too much, but if anyone's familiar with TCFD modeling, it's going to replicate that to almost an as sort of copy extent through what IFRS is doing internationally. There is another side of it around sort of public policy and the impacts on public policy and on climate action. That'll sort of follow along probably early next year as well as a sort of a potential next sort of step. So that's really where we're at in terms of what's going to impact municipalities in Canada probably over the next 2 to 3 years.
That's great. That's another plug for NZAP, and we're working on some guidance for the climate-related financial disclosures world as well, which, as you say, is a moving target right now. So that brings us to the end of the panel. Thank you all for your contributions here, but for also just for all your work in climate budgeting, because NZAP has gained really tremendously from all the work that you've done over the past years in this space. So I'm going to pass it back over to Emma, and she's going to speak about the opportunity to become a pilot community and participate in our upcoming peer learning cohorts. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Megan. I'm just going to share, we're just going to get the screens back up right now. Hopefully you'll be able to see the English as well as the French survey. And I'm going to take a moment to share a bit about the opportunity to become a pilot community and engage with NZAP further. So as a research action partnership, the work of NZAP goes beyond simply releasing a climate budgeting guide into the landscape. We want to follow along, support you, and learn from your experience as you implement climate budgeting practices in your municipality. And to that end, we'd like to invite you to become a pilot community and provide feedback on our resources. So by becoming a pilot community, you'll benefit from access to further training on this resource and others, including free access to micro-credentials being developed by the University of Waterloo. To support communities further in the implementation of this guide, we're offering a peer learning cohort opportunity exclusive to pilot communities, launching in October, as you can see on the screen. With a mix of sessions facilitated bilingually, these cohorts will be designed to support communities as they implement the best practices outlined in the guide. Any community that signs up to pilot a guide will receive an invitation to apply to participate in the cohorts, and we anticipate sending out those invitations to apply to become part of those cohorts at the end of July. For more information and to express your interest, we encourage you to follow the link on the screen, or if you have specific questions, I invite you to reach out to me directly. My email is on the screen. And with that, I'm going to proceed to the end of our webinar today. But before we wrap up, I want to highlight that, as Megan mentioned earlier, we have a number of exciting launches of new resources, including the guide on financial disclosures that will be coming up in the coming months. But our next webinar is on community partnerships for equitable local climate action, coming up on July 24th, which will provide an overview of how your municipality can build strong partnerships to achieve community-wide climate action targets and equity goals. We encourage you to register via the QR code or the link that my colleagues will pop in the chat. And with that, I'd like to thank you for joining our webinar today. To capture your feedback on the webinar, we'd really like to encourage you to fill out the survey that my colleagues will launch. It should pop up on your screen to tell us what you thought about the webinar today, and it also offers you the opportunity to fill out what future topics that you might want to hear from NZAP. Or actually it doesn't, so maybe pop those in the chat. We'd love to hear, as we continue to develop more training opportunities, we are looking for topics and we'd love to hear what you would benefit from. And as you quickly take 20 seconds to fill out the survey, I'd like to just quickly share another upcoming webinar on in early July that my colleagues from the Green Municipal Fund on the adaptation side are running on climate resilient buildings. The QR code is there for you to scan and sign up for that webinar. Great. Okay. And with that, that is the end of our webinar today. I'd like to thank all of our panelists, presenters for sharing your expertise throughout the webinar today. Much appreciated.